We are now moving into chapter 2 in developmental psychology, talking about biological beginnings and how we actually came to be. And obviously our book is going to come at it from a different perspective than we are, but we are going to be coming at it, as this first screen reminds us, from a biblical perspective. Psalm 127:3, children are an heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. And we're going to continually be reminded that, hopefully in this chapter, you'll be reminded that we are divinely created. There is an intelligent designer behind our being. And hopefully the principles that we talk about in this chapter will solidify that truth for you in your own heart and your own mind. We need to just unpack the idea that obviously our book is coming at the idea of DNA and genetics and our beginnings from an evolutionary standpoint and worldview. The book emphasizes the idea, the importance of adaptation, natural selection, adaptive behavior, reproduction, survival of the fittest and shaping behavior, Darwin and his observations, how all organisms must adapt in life in order to be able to survive. And obviously our author promotes this perspective. We call this evolutionary psychology, and we obviously are coming at this from a biblical perspective. We try to explain behavior and understand development from a biblical perspective. What does God have to say about this? Not necessarily what Darwin or any other scientist has to say about this. So with that in mind, we're going to start with our genetic foundations. Obviously, we cannot talk about the birth process without talking about genetics and how it even begins and how life happens. I want to set up just some definitions to make sure that we understand some of the definitions. Now, remember that Mrs. Miller is not a scientist in any way, shape, or form. I am the information I am going to be giving to you on these slides is very minimal, very shallow, very surface. This is what I want you to know for this class. I am not a scientist, so I don't get into all the ins and outs and all the different dynamics that are involved in the DNA structures, but these are just the things that I need you to know for developmental psychology this semester. So DNA is referred to as the collaborative gene. There are different things that make up our DNA, and I want to kind of focus on those things with you. First of all, chromosomes. These are thread-like structures that contain sequences of genes, and I'm going to show you on the next slide what these things look like. And then our DNA is that molecule that's inside that chromosome. It contains our genetic information. It's a double helix, kind of a squirrely kind of a shape. And then a segment of our DNA is breaking it down even farther that contains our hereditary code, are our genes. So let's kind of take a look at it here. You see the chromosome, you see the DNA, and then the segment of a small segment of that DNA is called our genes or our genetics. You do need to be familiar with the Human Genome Project. Your book references that, not just in this chapter. You'll hear about it from on occasion as you read through the textbook. And the Human Genome Project started back probably-ish 10 years ago-ish, and they are looking for ways that genetics are the reason for certain disorders and certain different kinds of problems that are in our society. And they have actually uncovered quite a few connections, and they're still around, and they are still trying to find the connections between genetics and disorders and other things like that in our society. When we're talking about biological beginnings and genetics and things like that, we've got to talk about the mitosis, meiosis, or meiosis, however you say that, and the fertilization process. These are the terms here. You need to know the difference between mitosis and meiosis, or meiosis, however you call it. And this is all I need you to know about this. We're not going to get into all the scientific ramifications of this. I'm not going to unpack this. These are the things that I just want you to know. This is the basis of life. This is where life begins. Mitosis is a form of cell reproduction. It's when the cell reproduces. It duplicates replicates itself. It's kind of how our cell, our bodies repair. Our body grows and our body repairs itself by cellular reproduction. And then meiosis is again, it's a process of cell division where the cell is reproducing itself in a sense. It's more dividing than it is reproducing. But this is what causes fertilization, and this is how fertilization happens. Reproduction or fertilization happens when a female gamete, an ovum, is fertilized by a male gamete, the sperm, and we're going to discuss that a little further in this unit. I want you to know that a zygote then is that single cell that is formed through fertilization. So when the two come together, conception happens. The zygote is that cell, a baby, as we would refer to it. This is kind of a nice little graphic of mitosis versus meiosis or meiosis. Remember, mitosis is the cell reproduction. It's duplicating itself and it's dividing. It's duplicating itself and it's dividing. You'll notice that these cells have every cell has 46 chromosomes in it. These are called diploid cells. Di meaning 2. Okay, more than it's kind of multiplied by 2. So diploid meaning 23 times 2. There's 46 chromosomes in all of these cells that are going through the process of mitosis. In meiosis, however, you'll notice that you start with a diploid cell, but then it divides into what we call a haploid cell. That is a cell with only 23 chromosomes. That's why it's only the N there, not the 2N, if you will. And these cells then divide, and they reproduce and they divide twice. Then they form 4 haploid cells, and each of these haploid cells then are unpaired. There's nothing that's paired up with them. So you have 4 cells with 23 unpaired chromosomes waiting for that other to come and connect with them. So in the male, these 23 cells that have 23 unpaired chromosomes each, these haploid cells, they are called germ cells, and they are found in females in the sex organs, which are the ovaries, and they're found in the males in the sex organs, which is the testes and the sperm inside of them. And so in the female, obviously, it's waiting for the sperm to come, and in the male, the sperm goes to the female to connect and then to form, to fertilize and then form a zygote. On the process of mitosis, this reproduction and division happens in somatic cells, which is pretty much found throughout your entire body. However, the haploid cells and the meiosis or meiosis process is found only in the germ cells, which are the sex organs of your body. If you'll notice, this is what a normal or a typical set of chromosomes look like for a normal human being. You've got 22 evenly paired sets of chromosomes, and then the very last set are the sex chromosomes. This tells us if this person is a male or a female. You'll notice this is a double X, meaning this is a female. If it were a male, it would have an X and a Y chromosome at the end. The presence of the Y factor is what makes it a male. So females are double X and males are XY. I want you to know the difference between genotypes and phenotypes. There is a sort of variability in genetics, and there are unique combinations, obviously, when you take those 4 single cells with the 23 unpaired chromosomes. Some of those chromosomes are coming from your father, some of them are coming from your mother, and then you pair them with another's a sperm or an egg from another, you're obviously going to have unique combinations, and there's going to be major variability in genetics because of that. So I want you to know the difference between what a genotype is and what a phenotype is. A genotype is your actual genetic DNA. This is your actual genetic material, your genetic heritage. This is what you're receiving from your mom and dad. So some of you have the genotype of having brown hair, brown eyes. Some of you have have blonde hair, blonde eyes. These are genotypes. Some of you have genes that you have some blonde hair genes and you have some brown hair genes. Some of you have blue eye genes and brown eye genes and maybe even hazel eye genes. These are all part of the chromosomes in your body, and these are things that actually when you go, then you have children, you could potentially pass on to your own children. Now the phenotype then is the way that those genotypes are actually expressed and we see them. So a phenotype would be, oh, a person they actually have brown hair. Even though they have several genotypes, maybe they have brown and blonde in their genotype, their phenotype is brown hair. Maybe they have the genotypes of blue or hazel or brown eyes, but their phenotype, how it's expressed, what we actually see in them is their brown eyes. Now remember that sometimes genes, there can be a problem with gene mutation. Gene mutation often happens from damage from some kind of an agent that attacks from the outside, an environmental agent often, maybe mistake. I think of nuclear reactors and an act of God, providence could cause a gene mutation, but there is variability in genetics. That's what I want you to know. There's unique combinations, and sometimes those genes can mutate, and therefore they can create problems when they mutate. There are some overarching genetic principles that you need to be aware of and understand, and you may have heard of these very things before. The first of all is probably something you have heard of before, is the dominant recessive gene principle. This is when you've got genes in a pair. One gene in a pair always exerts itself over the other gene. So if you have in a pair, you've got a blue eye gene and you've got a brown eye gene. Well, generally, the brown eye gene is considered dominant. So generally speaking, the brown eye gene usually overrides that blue eye gene, that recessive gene. So the dominant is the brown, the recessive is the blue. There are all kinds of dominant recessive things. You've got even the dark hair. The blonde hair is recessive to brown hair, whereas usually red hair is actually more dominant than all of them. So there are different things are going to exert themselves because one is more dominant than the other. Sex-linked genes are genes that are usually carried on the X chromosome, and when you have genes that are carried on the X chromosome, because males have only one X chromosome in their chromosome makeup, they're X and Y, remember? Females are double X, but males are X and Y. And because sex-linked genes are carried on X chromosomes, males then are more susceptible to having only that X chromosome have a problem. So if something is broken in the male X chromosome, they don't have an extra X chromosome to kind of make up for that. And usually we see sex-linked genes on the male side more than we do on the female side because of that. And then there's the idea of polygenetic inheritance. These are that sometimes many genes work together or interact together, if you will, to produce a characteristic trait. So it's not just that a characteristic trait happened because this gene worked in this situation. No, it's usually an interaction of many different genes. Actually, few characteristic traits reflect the influence of just a single gene or a single pair of genes. There's all kinds of genetics that are working together to make you, to make the characteristics that you personally have you. So polygenetic. So dominant recessive, sex-linked genes, and polygenetic inheritance are just some of the principles that I want you to be aware of. This is kind of how, if you've got, you talk about the dominant recessive principle, this is how brown-haired parents can have a blonde-haired child. So you've got two people with brown hair who have dominant genes, obviously, of brown hair, and yet they can still have a blonde-haired child. But if you notice in their genetic makeup, the father has the big B, stands for the brown hair, the dominant gene, but he also is carrying a small b, which is blonde. And mother, same thing. She's got the big B and the small b. So if you kind of go through all of this. This is math, and I'm not very good at math, but if you notice, statistics prove that they could have very well a BB, a blonde child. Okay, the gene for blonde hair is recessive, by the way. So chances are, just because you marry somebody that has a dominant, has a dominant characteristic trait, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have children with the same. There are, when we're talking about genetics, obviously there are abnormalities that are chromosomal and genetically linked. There are some abnormalities that are not, or that we cannot prove that they're genetically linked, or we cannot prove they're chromosomally linked, but there are that we do know are definitely chromosomally linked and genetically linked. The first one is probably the most well known is Down syndrome. The scientific term for Down syndrome is trisomy 21, and the reason being is there is an extra chromosome on the 21st pair. So they call it trisomy 321, so three chromosomes on the 21st chromosome, basically. This is a chromosomally transmitted form of mental retardation or intellectual disability. They actually don't use the word mental retardation anymore. They do prefer the term intellectual disability. And you know what kids with Down syndrome look like. They have the round face, usually the flattened skull. They usually have an eye situation where there's an extra fold of skin over their eyelids. They have a tongue that usually is more protruding. They often have very short limbs and short fingers, and their intellectual and motor disabilities are usually impaired, or they usually don't develop as well as their same age peers. So Down syndrome is another word for that is trisomy 21. There are some sex-linked chromosome abnormalities, and we're going to talk about those. These are caused by problems with the sex chromosomes. This is kind of a chromosome makeup of a male with Down syndrome. You see the X and the Y at the end, and then there are 3 X chromosomes on the 21st chromosome, so trisomy 21. These are those sex-linked chromosome abnormalities that you could encounter. The first one is called Klinefelter syndrome. This is when males have an extra X chromosome. So they would have a double X and a Y. This is often in this syndrome, you're going to see the males are going to look a little different. They're going to look a little more, they're going to have underdeveloped testes. Their breasts, generally speaking, will be more enlarged, and they're usually very tall in stature. And the Klinefelter is usually not identified until adulthood, which really makes sense because, you know, the underdevelopment of those sex characteristics or the overdevelopment of the breasts would gives that indication of, okay, wait a minute, maybe something is not right here. And it makes sense that they have underdeveloped testes, which is a male organ, but overdeveloped breast, which is more on the female side. They have that extra X chromosome that is kind of connecting that. Fragile X syndrome is an abnormality in the X chromosome. So it's kind of broken, maybe, or maybe it becomes constricted, it's bent, or it's not quite right. And this often results in some form of intellectual disability. Sometimes they also have connected Fragile X chromosome with autism and learning disabilities. Often these children have short attention spans as well. Turner syndrome is something that attacks females. These are females that are missing an X chromosome, so they only have one X chromosome, and they are often very short in stature. They have what's called a webbed neck, a very wide, and it almost looks webbed, very skin kind of taut and very webbed. Many of these females, most of the time, they are infertile. They cannot reproduce, and they are very poor mathematically. But what's interesting about them is they often have a very good verbal ability. They're able to talk, and they very good with words. So smart just maybe have some weaknesses in certain areas, especially in the area of mathematics. And then finally, the Human Genome Project has just come up with this one in the past few years, the XYY syndrome. This is with a male who has an extra Y chromosome. And remember, the Y chromosome is what carries the male gene. And research now is actually linking this to violence and aggression in young men. So they're finding kids that have the extra Y syndrome are more violent and more aggressive than others. Other abnormalities are carried on the genes, not just on the chromosomes. We also have genetically linked abnormalities. One of them is PKU. I hate pronouncing this word, so I'm not even going to try to do it. This is where a person cannot properly metabolize an amino acid in their diet. And if you leave this untreated, it can result in intellectual disability and major hyperactivity. And it usually occurs in non-Latino whites. So this is in the Caucasian race. However, PKU, even though it's a genetic disorder, it can be treated with diet. And people that have PKU have done very well just by adjusting their diet so that they can then properly metabolize what they're eating. Sickle cell anemia, I'm sure you've heard of. This is where it affects the red blood cells, and it occurs most often in people of African descent, African Americans usually. And then there are others. Cystic fibrosis, diabetes is a genetically linked abnormality. Hemophilia is another one. Spina bifida, muscular dystrophy, you've heard of all of these. These are all linked to genetic issues and abnormalities. There are scientists, psychologists, they study behavior genetics. One of the reasons why we're studying genetics is we like to just, okay, how much of the environment is making an influence on how a person is, and how much is it really is truly genetics or hereditary factors. And so they take twins and they study twins for this. So they like to look at the behavioral similarity of identical twins, and then they compare them with the behavioral similarity of fraternal twins. Now remember, fraternal twins share the same womb, but they don't share the same identical genetics. So if you're looking at them, which is very interesting about them, the identical twins share the same womb and they share the same genetic makeup, but the fraternal twins do not share the same identical makeup, and maybe they'll have the same kind of environment. So looking at the differences helps scientists to determine, okay, how much influence is genetics having on this, and how much influence is the environment having on this. And they've done some adoption studies where they've gone out and they're studying, they've done these longitudinal studies trying to determine, okay, do adopted children act more like their adoptive parents, or do they act more like their biological parents? They have had studies where some twins, they've had twins adopted into 2 different homes, and these twins come up with the same characteristic traits even though they are adopted into 2 different homes, reared by 2 different families in completely different environments, and yet they have the same kind of characteristic trait that their biological parents actually passed on to them, even though they were reared in completely different areas. So adoptive parents, they do contribute the home environment, and biological parents contribute genetics. And the question that behavior geneticists are looking at is, which is greater? I also wanted to touch on genotype environment correlations. This is kind of, geneticists are saying that there is a correlation between genetics and the environment. And there are different types of them that they're finding. The first one that I want you to be aware of is called the passive genotype environment correlation. This is where you've got parents who might have some kind of a genetic predisposition to something, and then they also provide an environment that kind of fosters that in their own children. So for example, you've got a parent who might have a genetic predisposition to intelligence. They're very intelligent in their genetic code, and they also are very skillful readers. So then they provide an environment that encourages that for their child and the genetic disposition. So their children then will become the same. This is something that's more common, if you will, in the lives of young children, infants, than it is in adolescents per se. But the idea here is that natural parents are providing genetic heritage, their genetic DNA code, and they're providing a positive rearing environment to encourage that genetic heritage, if you will. Then there's the idea of the evocative correlation. This is the idea that a child's genetic makeup is evoking something from the outside, or usually from adults or other people. And so you've got maybe an active, smiling child. Often receives more social stimulation than a passive, quiet child. Cooperative, attentive children evoke more pleasant responses from adults than uncooperative, distracted children do. So what's going on here is a child's genetic tendencies are eliciting, they're evoking positive support or stimuli from an environment that supports a particular trait. So they often gravitate naturally toward what they're good at because they get praised for those things. So they're evoking certain things. So if I'm born with a happy temperament and I evoke certain social stimulus where people are patting me on the back, or they're encouraging me, then I am going to gravitate towards things that I'm positively good at. Then the final one is the active or the niche picking. Have you ever heard the expression, I got to find my niche? This is the idea, you got to find a spot where it works for you. And this is where children tend to seek out environments that they find compatible and stimulating. So outgoing children tend to choose social contexts where they can interact with others. Shy children tend to choose things where they don't have to interact with others. They're finding their niche in the world. Okay, so active, niche picking, evocative, and passive correlations. And then finally, geneticists are talking about shared and non-shared environmental experiences. This goes back, kind of even back when we're talking about the twin studies here. They're looking at, okay, what makes siblings, some of them have a certain genetic disposition and another genetic disposition. What makes them tick? Why do some characteristics come out in some siblings and others don't, and others? So they're looking at, they like to study siblings' shared environmental experience. So if you think about your own upbringing and your own life, there are many things that you and your siblings share together about your upbringing. And probably if you get together with your siblings on any regular basis, you talk about some of those shared things that you did. Maybe it's the traditions that your family held, or maybe it's just the day in and day out experiences that you had as a family together. Maybe it's kind of the wonky things that your mom and dad did, in comparison to your friends, or those kinds of things. Your common environmental experiences. But if you take any time and you think about your own upbringing and in comparison to your siblings, you could probably pinpoint multiple things where your experience was a little unique. Even though you were reared right alongside of your siblings, you had some unique experiences that were not shared by another sibling. So obviously these non-shared environmental experiences are going to impact you developmentally speaking. When I think about my own upbringing, I am the oldest of 6 children in total, and some of my experiences are completely different than some of my siblings' experiences, and that kind of goes back to some of the choices that I made, and even in comparison to some of the choices they made, the college I chose to go to, so on and so forth. I've had many experiences that were not shared by my siblings, and also very much many environmental experiences that we did share. So the epigenetic view, we're going to talk about, okay, so then let's bring this all together. What do we believe about heredity and the environment? Is it genetics that makes us who we are? Is it the environment that makes us who we are? And we're going to continually come back to, no, it's neither, because the epigenetic view, which is the view that most psychologists would take, is that both genetics and both environment work together interchangeably to make us who we are. Development is a result of ongoing bidirectional interchange between the two. It is not all heredity and all environment, or this and that. It is an exchange between the two. And the idea here is there is a range of they call it reaction range. There is a range of possible phenotypes for each genotype. And basically what this is saying, so when you have a genetic disposition to, let's say, intelligence, how intelligent you actually become really is going to be dependent upon the environment, whether it's restrictive or it's rich. Let's say you have a genetic tendency towards being gifted in the area of music. How musical you actually become really is going to be dependent upon the environment that you are reared in. Did your parents encourage that musical tendency? Did they give you piano lessons or whatever have you? Did you grow up in a restrictive environment or a rich environment? Genetics is complex. Development is very complex. There is not one reason or another that we can pinpoint and say this is why people become who they are. But we do know that an individual's development involves a specific environment, and that is complex, just like the genes we inherit. The genes we inherit are complex. The environment that you're reared in is complex. And so the two of those are working together to make you who you are. Let's take a look at the responsiveness of the genotype and the phenotype situation here. If you'll notice, you've got different types of people here, and the where they are in the chart is telling us, okay, what their IQ is, basically. And if you'll notice, as you go to the right of the chart, the farther right you get is the more favorable their environment is toward intelligence. Okay. And as they're going on, the environment is getting more and more favorable. And you'll notice as the environment gets more favorable, what happens to their IQ? It raises. So the idea here is that environment does play a healthy part in making our genetic propensities come to light and magnify even more. So let's conclude. There is heredity and the environment definitely operate together in tangent together. There are some contributions of genetics, and the contributions of environment are not additive. In other words, we can't say that such and such a percentage come from our genetics and such a percentage come from our environment. We just cannot do that. The two do work together, but we can't figure out how much, and we can't pinpoint that. Many complex behaviors likely have some kind of genetic loading that may give someone a propensity for someone, and that's part of that Human Genome Project. They are trying to figure that out and unpack that. That is all for genetics and the biological beginnings portion of this chapter. Please make sure that you know this information. You will see it on your test. Have a great day.